In December 1943, the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff's Second Bureau produced an intelligence estimate that would prove disastrously wrong. According to their calculations, the United States Navy should have around 13,070 officers and 296,000 enlisted personnel by the end of the month. The estimate was built on careful analysis of pre-war American naval capacity, recruitment patterns, and training systems. Japanese intelligence had tracked U.S. shipbuilding with notable precision. They knew how many carriers were under construction, how many destroyers would soon enter service, and how many submarines were being produced. But they had completely misjudged something far more critical: they had no accurate sense of how many people were actually serving in the American fleet. The real numbers were shocking. By December 1943, the U.S. Navy had 219,279 officers, 120,472 officer candidates, and 2,034,343 enlisted men. Total strength was roughly 2.4 million personnel. Japan had predicted 309,000. The miscalculation was 7.6 to 1. Japanese planners were basing all major strategic decisions on the assumption that they faced a U.S. fleet with perhaps twice their manpower. In reality, they were confronting a navy with 7 times more personnel than they believed. That single intelligence failure meant every assumption about American logistics capacity, operational speed, and replacement ability was fundamentally flawed. The mistake began with a deep cultural blind spot. Major General Okamoto, head of the Army General Staff's Second Bureau at the start of the Pacific War, led an intelligence branch that entered the conflict with merely 20 officers and 20 enlisted men studying foreign militaries. Their primary focus had long been the Soviet Union. Only 2 or 3 officers handled air intelligence. The Army War College offered almost no meaningful intelligence training. Japanese military culture prioritized battlefield skill and aggressive tactics. Intelligence work was treated as a secondary duty, often assigned to average officers instead of top-tier talent. This institutional weakness meant that when Japan needed a full analysis of American industrial mobilization, they lacked both the manpower and the specialized knowledge to do it effectively. Japanese intelligence personnel had examined the American and British navies extensively before the war, but their studies focused almost solely on tactics, ship characteristics, and fleet composition. Virtually no one paid attention to Western shipyard expansion, large-scale crew mobilization, or training pipelines. The idea that the United States might completely overhaul its approach to military personnel development never entered Japanese strategic thinking. A Japanese journalist wrote in 1943 that the nation was entirely unable to step back and view the motives and thought processes of other countries with objectivity. As a result, Japan simply could not interpret global realities without emotion or bias. This cultural limitation deeply affected the intelligence services. The first clear sign that something was wrong with their personnel estimates came not from analysis, but from battlefield encounters. During the Guadalcanal campaign, which began in August 1942, Japanese forces initially estimated that only 2,000 American Marines were on the island. They assumed the landing was nothing more than a reconnaissance operation. But once fighting began, Japanese commanders discovered there were over 10,000 Americans on Guadalcanal. Later in the same campaign, they estimated 10,000 U.S. troops were present when the actual number was 23,000. The pattern appeared everywhere in the Pacific. Japanese officers estimated General Douglas MacArthur's Bataan Army at 25,000 men, when the real number was 80,000. They estimated British forces in Singapore at 30,000, but there were 85,000. They believed the Midway garrison had 750 men and 60 aircraft, when in fact it had 3,027 men and 121 combat aircraft. These repeated tactical intelligence failures should have prompted a full reassessment of American military power. They did not. The Japanese command structure was highly fragmented. The Army General Staff, the Navy General Staff, and the Imperial General Headquarters all operated with considerable independence. Intelligence was not shared effectively between branches. Even more critically, intelligence that conflicted with existing operational plans was frequently ignored or dismissed. Japanese military culture during this period did not reward officers who delivered unwelcome assessments. The emphasis was on fighting spirit. tactical excellence, and offensive operations, suggesting that the enemy was far stronger than estimated was seen as defeatist. What Japanese intelligence missed entirely was the scale of American training infrastructure. On December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had approximately 6,000 recruits in training at Naval Station Great Lakes near Chicago, Illinois. This single facility, built on the shores of Lake Michigan, hundreds of miles from any ocean, would become the primary production facility for American sailors. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Great Lakes had 68,000 recruits in training. By September 1942, more than 100,000 sailors were training there simultaneously. The base expanded to 1,600 acres. More than 700 instructors ran continuous training cycles between Pearl Harbor and the Japanese surrender in August 1945. Naval Station Great Lakes alone trained over 1 million sailors. That single facility processed more personnel than the entire Japanese Navy fielded at its peak. Japanese reconnaissance never detected this. Great Lakes was deep in the American interior, far from any coastal areas Japanese aircraft could reach. Intelligence officers knew the facility existed from pre-war records, but they had no way to observe its massive wartime expansion. Their estimates were based on the facility's pre-war capacity, which was designed for perhaps 20,000 personnel maximum. They had no framework for understanding that Americans would build temporary structures, convert civilian buildings, and operate multiple shifts to process 5 times the designed capacity. But Great Lakes was just the beginning. The United States Navy established 4 entirely new major training stations during the war, each built from scratch, specifically for wartime mobilization. Naval Training Station Sampson opened in New York in 1942 and could process 20,000 recruits simultaneously. Naval Training Station Farragut opened in Idaho in September 1942 in a remote mountain valley. It trained nearly 300,000 sailors before closing in 1945. Naval Training Station Bainbridge opened in Maryland in October 1942. Each facility was built on massive scale, using rapid construction techniques. Japanese intelligence knew about none of them. These bases didn't exist in pre-war records. They were built too quickly to track through normal intelligence channels. They were located in areas Japan had no ability to observe directly. The intelligence failure went deeper than training facilities. In July 1943, the United States Navy launched the V-12 program, a revolutionary college-based officer training system. The program operated on 131 university campuses across America. It took high school graduates and college students, put them on active duty as apprentice seamen, sent them to University for Technical Education, and then commissioned them as officers after graduation. Between July 1943 and June 1946, more than 125,000 men went through the V-12 program. That single program produced more officers than Japanese intelligence estimated the entire American Navy would have in total personnel. The V-12 program operated at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Notre Dame, Cornell, Northwestern, and dozens of other universities. Students studied engineering, navigation, communications, and foreign languages. They lived in dormitories converted to military barracks and attended classes alongside civilian students while subject to military discipline. The program created a pipeline that could produce thousands of technical specialists every semester. Japanese intelligence never detected it. They knew American universities existed, and that some had naval ROC programs, but they had no conception that the Americans had converted their entire higher education system into a military training infrastructure. American mobilization operated on principles completely foreign to Japanese military thinking. Japan had built its navy through decades of careful cultivation. Officers attended the Naval Academy for years. Technical specialists underwent extensive training programs. Crews drilled constantly to achieve precision. Quality was paramount. The Japanese Navy was professional, highly skilled, and extremely capable. But it was small, and when ships were sunk or pilots killed or crews lost, they couldn't be replaced quickly. The entire system was built on the assumption that wars would be decided by the quality of forces in being at the start of conflict. America took the opposite approach. They decided that scale mattered more than individual perfection. They built training systems that could process millions of people. They accepted that individual sailors might be less skilled than their Japanese counterparts. Initially, they compensated with overwhelming numbers, superior logistics, and continuous replacement capability. An American destroyer that lost crew in combat could return to port, take on fresh sailors straight from training, and be back at sea within weeks. A Japanese destroyer with similar casualties might wait months for replacements if they could be found at all. The Americans also solved a problem Japan never recognized existed. Most American recruits came from inland areas, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Kansas. These people had never seen the ocean, much less served on a ship. The Navy built enormous swimming pools at bases in the middle of the country to teach swimming. They constructed ship simulators on dry land. They created standardized training manuals that any instructor at any facility could use. They industrialized education the same way they had industrialized manufacturing. A recruit class at Great Lakes had 1,000 men receiving identical instruction on identical schedules using identical equipment. When they graduated, they might not be as individually skilled as Japanese sailors, but there were 1,000 of them, and another 1,000 was already in training behind them. By late 1943, American production of trained sailors had reached industrial scale. Great Lakes was graduating classes every few weeks. The V-12 program was commissioning hundreds of new officers every semester. Specialized technical schools produced radar operators, sonar technicians, fire control specialists, and communications experts. The pipeline ran continuously, and was accelerating. The more people America trained, the more the trainers they had. Graduates became instructors. Officers who completed technical training taught the next class. The system was self-reinforcing and growing exponentially. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to replace losses. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and most of the highly trained flight crews aboard them. Those pilots represented years of training. They couldn't be quickly replaced. Japan tried to accelerate pilot training programs, but they didn't have enough instructors, enough aircraft, or enough fuel for training flights. Each loss made the problem worse. Fewer experienced pilots meant fewer instructors, meant lower quality training, meant higher losses. It was a death spiral that by late 1943 was well underway. The personnel miscalculation had strategic consequences. Japanese leadership couldn't fully grasp Japanese submarines operating in 1944 repeatedly reported being stunned by the volume of American logistics traffic. They would sink supply vessels, tankers, and troop transports. American convoys would just keep coming. More ships, more supplies, more people. Japanese submarine commanders couldn't understand where all the crews were coming from. The answer was simple. They had trained over 2 million of them, but Japan still thought they only had 300,000 American prisoners of war interrogated by Japanese intelligence officers, often mentioned the scale of American training programs. They talked about bases with 100,000 personnel, training centers processing thousands of recruits every week, university campuses filled with men in naval uniforms. Japanese interrogators thought these statements were exaggerations or propaganda. Nobody could train that many people that quickly. It was impossible. Except it wasn't. It was just impossible within the framework of how Japan understood military organization. One documented case illustrates this disconnect. After the Battle of Midway, the Japanese captured several American aviators. During interrogation, these prisoners described training facilities they had attended. The scale they described seemed absurd to Japanese interrogators. They reported training classes with hundreds of students, facilities that could house tens of thousands of personnel, training programs that took civilian recruits and turned them into pilots or sailors in a matter of months. Japanese intelligence officers believed the prisoners were inflating numbers to deceive their captives. The idea that America could actually operate on that scale didn't fit Japanese assumptions about how military training worked. The turning point where the personnel disparity became undeniable was the Marianas Campaign in June and July 1944. American forces assaulted Saipan, Tinian, and Guam with overwhelming strength. Japanese defenders on those islands reported being stunned by the sheer number of American troops coming ashore. Wave after wave of landing craft, thousands of Marines, continuous naval gunfire support, airstrikes that never stopped. Logistics that kept flowing no matter how much resistance Japanese forces offered. Japanese commanders on Saipan sent desperate messages to Tokyo, describing the assault force as enormous beyond anything they had anticipated. After the Maranas fell, the Japanese naval general staff finally commissioned a comprehensive review of American military capabilities. The review, conducted in September 1944, concluded that previous estimates of American personnel strength had been significantly incorrect, based on operational evidence, intercepted communications, and analysis of American logistics observed in combat. The review estimated that United States Navy strength was approximately 1.8 to 2.2 million personnel. This was nearly 6 times higher than estimates that had been in use since 1942. The review recommended immediate revision of all strategic plans to account for dramatically higher American personnel and logistics capacity. The recommendations were never meaningfully implemented. By September 1944, Japan had already lost the decisive battles of the Pacific War. The combined fleet had been shattered at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American submarines had devastated Japanese merchant shipping. The strategic situation was effectively hopeless. Knowing that the Americans had 2 million sailors instead of 300,000 didn't change the fact that Japan had already lost control of the Pacific. The intelligence failure had consequences, but those consequences were already locked in by the time Japanese leadership acknowledged the scope of their miscalculation. The institutional factors that caused this intelligence failure were deeply rooted in Japanese military culture. Intelligence officers were not highly valued within the military hierarchy. The most talented officers went to command positions or operational planning roles. Intelligence was seen as a supporting function rather than a critical capability. This meant that even when intelligence officers identified problems with estimates, they lacked the institutional authority to force revisions against the preferences of operational commanders who wanted to believe the enemy was weaker. Additionally, the Japanese military services operated with significant rivalry and limited coordination. The Army and Navy had separate intelligence organizations that rarely shared information effectively. Intelligence about American training capacity might have been noticed by one service but never communicated to the other. The fragmented structure meant that even when pieces of accurate intelligence existed, they weren't assembled into a comprehensive picture that could drive strategic revision. The intelligence failure was also compounded by confirmation bias at the highest levels of Japanese command. Military planners had convinced themselves that America was fundamentally unsuited for sustained warfare. They believed American culture was too individualistic, too focused on material comfort, too divided by regional and ethnic differences to effectively mobilize for total war. Any intelligence suggesting otherwise was unconsciously filtered out as unreliable. Senior commanders saw what they wanted to see and dismissed evidence that contradicted their preferred narrative. Post-war interrogations of Japanese intelligence officers by American occupation forces revealed the depth of this miscalculation. When American interrogators explained the actual scale of programs like the V-12 system or the expansion of facilities like Great Lakes, Japanese officers were genuinely shocked. Some initially refused to believe the numbers, even when presented with documentary evidence. The concept that America had trained millions of people in just a few years simply didn't fit their understanding of how military organizations functioned. One Japanese intelligence officer stated in a 1946 interrogation that if someone had told him during the war that America would field a navy of over 2 million people, he would have considered it impossible. Propaganda. The industrial capacity to build ships existed, but the ability to find, train, and deploy millions of sailors seemed beyond the realm of possibility. The irony is that American intelligence made the opposite mistake. In some areas, throughout 1942 and early 1943, American analysts consistently overestimated Japanese military capabilities in certain domains. They thought Japan had more aircraft than it did, more experienced pilots, more robust logistics. American commanders often planned operations assuming they faced a stronger enemy than actually existed. This caution probably saved lives. It meant American forces approached battles with appropriate preparation and overwhelming resources. They didn't underestimate their opponent. In Japan's case, underestimating American strength led to strategic decisions based on fantasy. By the time reality became undeniable, it was far too late to adjust course. The personnel intelligence failure had one unexpected consequence that Japanese leadership never anticipated. Because Japan believed American forces were smaller than they actually were, Japanese commanders often committed forces to battles they should have avoided. If Japanese strategic planning had accurately understood that they faced a navy 7 times larger than estimated, they might have pursued a more defensive strategy earlier. They might have recognized that decisive fleet engagements would inevitably favor an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority and unlimited replacement capacity. They might have focused on making the cost of advancing through the Pacific so high that America would seek a negotiated settlement rather than continuing offensive operations. Instead, Japanese forces repeatedly engaged American fleets in major battles throughout 1943 and 1944, suffering catastrophic losses of ships, aircraft, and irreplaceable trained personnel. Each engagement was planned based on the assumption that American strength was limited and that a decisive Japanese victory could shift the strategic balance. The reality was that every loss Japan suffered was permanent, while every loss America suffered was temporary. American logistics could replace destroyed ships within months. American training could replace lost crews within weeks. Japanese losses were simply gone, creating a cumulative deficit that grew worse with every engagement. The intelligence failure regarding American personnel also affected Japanese decisions about home, defense, and resource allocation. If Japanese planners had understood the actual scale of American naval power, they might have prioritized different defensive preparations. More resources might have gone to fortifying the home islands earlier in the war. More emphasis might have been placed on dispersing critical war production to reduce vulnerability to strategic bombing. More effort might have been devoted to developing weapons systems specifically suited for asymmetric defense against an overwhelming enemy. By 1945, the consequences of the personnel intelligence failure were visible in every aspect of Japan's strategic position. American task forces operated continuously across the Pacific with seemingly unlimited ships and crews. When vessels needed maintenance or refitting, replacements were available. When crews needed rest, fresh personnel rotated in. The sustained operational tempo was something Japanese forces simply couldn't match. Their fleet was limited by both the number of ships available and the number of trained crews to man them. American fleets faced neither constraint. The story of how Japan miscalculated American naval personnel strength by a factor of 7 to 1 is ultimately a story about institutional failure, cultural blind spots, and the dangers of seeing only what you want to see. Japanese intelligence organizations entered the war understaffed, undertrained, and undervalued within the military hierarchy. They focused on tactical details they understood while missing strategic realities they had no framework for comprehending. They collected data that contradicted their estimates but lacked the institutional authority or cultural permission to force revision of comfortable assumptions. The lesson isn't that Japanese intelligence officers were incompetent. Many were highly skilled at the work they did. They tracked American ship construction with impressive accuracy. They correctly predicted American industrial output in several key areas. But they completely missed the human dimension of American mobilization. They didn't understand that America would transform its educational system into a military training infrastructure. They didn't grasp that American culture, which they viewed as weak and individualistic, could mobilize millions of people for coordinated effort. They didn't anticipate that American industrial methods could be applied to producing trained personnel as effectively as they were applied to producing ships and weapons. The intelligence documents from this period that survived the war and were captured by American forces show Japanese analysts struggling with contradictory data. They had evidence that American bases were larger than estimated. They had prisoner statements describing massive training programs. They had operational reports showing American forces deploying in greater numbers than should have been possible. All of this evidence was available, but it wasn't synthesized into a comprehensive reassessment because doing so would have required acknowledging that Japan's entire war strategy was based on fundamentally flawed premises. That kind of admission was institutionally and culturally impossible until defeat made it unavoidable. The Japanese experience With intelligence failure regarding American naval personnel offers enduring lessons about the challenges of strategic assessment. Organizations tend to reject information that contradicts preferred narratives. Cultural assumptions influence what evidence is viewed as believable. Institutional hierarchies decide whose analysis is listened to. And the cost of being wrong when estimating an enemy's capabilities isn't just an academic mistake on a staff report. It means ships destroyed, battles lost, and ultimately a war that becomes unwinnable because you were facing an opponent you never truly understood. If you found this story interesting, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more overlooked accounts from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one is important. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would be glad to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history lovers, you are part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.